This is Dr. Stansel, and in this lecture I'll be introducing arguments and argument reconstruction. You've heard the term argument in everyday speech, and there it typically refers to a verbal conflict which can be heated and often pretty low in content, or it can be highly irrational. That's not what we are going to be studying in our course. So when we look at arguments and analyze arguments, we're going to be looking at verbal statements, whether they are oral or written, which provide rational justification for a point of view. The function of the arguments that we will be looking at will be to make a point of view compelling, to show that a point of view is reasonable. So they are highly rational. Emotion can enter into this kind of argument, but it's definitely secondary and doesn't play much of a role in how the argument functions. The kind of argument that we will be looking at is an important part of critical thinking and will be subject to critical analysis. So let's look at an example. Let's say that someone believes it's wrong to eat meat. They may offer an argument like this to provide support for their point of view. Animals feel pain when slaughtered and fear in the time leading up to slaughter. It is morally incumbent on us, which means it's morally required of us, to reduce suffering when we can. Since it's not necessary to eat meat, it's morally wrong to eat meat. The argument that we just looked at, like others that we'll study in the course, has a certain amount of complexity to it. And in order to handle that complexity and begin to analyze arguments, I'd like to introduce these terms: premise, which is a singular, premises is plural, and conclusion. And these terms are used to refer to the component parts of arguments. Here's our example again, and I've broken it down into those parts and have labeled each one. So we see that animals feel pain when slaughtered and fear in the time leading up to slaughter is the first premise. The second premise, it is morally incumbent on us to reduce pain when we can. The third premise, it's not necessary to eat meat. And the conclusion, it's morally wrong to eat meat. So we would say this argument has three premises and one conclusion. The conclusion is the point of view that the argument serves to support. In our example, the conclusion was it's morally wrong to eat meat. The premises are those statements which support or provide justification for the conclusion. And we might use the vocabulary, the premises entail the conclusion, or the conclusion follows from the premises. What this means is that if, and I'm saying if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's the kind of fit that we want to find between premises and the conclusion in a good, solid argument. Now, the argument that I've been using in this lecture as an example is a good argument in that way. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true and must be true according to the dictates of logic. Now, you might say, hey, I disagree with premise one. I don't think it's true. That's fine, and that's a different kind of evaluation that we will make of an argument. But let's not, I'm not going to go any further into that now, and I would ask you to not really pursue that any further at this point. This lecture is an introductory lecture. I want to talk to you about what arguments are, what their components are, and a very important goal of this lecture is to become comfortable with the vocabulary that I'm using. The words argument, premise, premises, and conclusion. Argument reconstruction is a way of identifying the key elements of an argument and making them clear in a written form which you produce. So I will often ask students to do argument reconstruction or using other words to reconstruct arguments. And if I ask you to do that, what I want you to do is first identify the premises and the conclusion of the argument, and then state those premises and the conclusion in your own way, using your own words, your own word order, and your own sentence structure. What I'm wanting you to do is express the author's meaning, but in a fresh way that you write from scratch. The goal when we do argument reconstruction, like I said, is to clarify and reveal the structure of the argument and its essence, to really show how it functions. So when we restate the author's premises and conclusion, not only do we want to do that in our own fresh way, but more specifically, we want to do that in a way that is clear, simple, and straightforward without losing meaning. Often we're going to find an argument that is being presented in a reading in a very long paragraph, and there's repetition in there. There may be side remarks that don't really have to do with the argument itself. There may be other kinds of additional material that doesn't really contribute to the argument. So when you do argument reconstruction, you're pulling out just the premises and the conclusion and stating them in a way that makes them more clear, so that we can really look at this argument and what it means and how it works. We will find in some of the readings that we look at some very long, wordy sentences. We may find some antiquated vocabulary or just some unnecessarily complex vocabulary. So it is really important that you think about bringing clarity to the argument. So again, just to re-emphasize this second bullet point, you want to state the premises and the conclusion not only in your own way, without losing the original meaning, but in a way that is clear, simple, and straightforward. Now, to do this, you really have to understand the argument. So I find that asking a student to do argument reconstruction is a good way to gauge how well they understand the argument. And when I see how well a student understands an argument, then I can help them to understand it better. Having you do argument reconstruction can show me the places where you don't quite understand it, and the places where you do have it. So it's a really useful learning activity. Okay, let me talk about the rest of these bullets. They all describe how to do argument reconstruction. They're all important. Third bullet says that you write the premises 1 to a line, and you label the lines premise 1, premise 2, or you can use P1, P2, and so on. You write the conclusion last and label that line as conclusion or just C for conclusion. Finally, use complete sentences that end in a period. Please don't put any questions in your argument reconstruction, even if there are questions in the original reading. Remember that the job of a premise is to help support the conclusion. A question never really helps support a conclusion, but a premise, which is a declarative statement ending in a period, can help give justification or support for a conclusion. Here are some tips for you about approaching argument reconstruction. When you sit down to do it, what's the first thing you should do and how should you move through this process? Well, the first thing you should do is identify the conclusion of the argument. Once you know the conclusion, then it's a lot easier to look for the premises because, after all, they support the conclusion. Supporting the conclusion is the overall goal of the argument. So once you know what that goal is, it's a lot easier to find the elements of the argument. You may have to look in different places in the reading to find the conclusion. Sometimes an author will state it first, or they'll state it at the end, or they may state it in the middle. Sometimes they only state their conclusion in the title. So it's always a really good idea to look at the title of the article, as that can actually often be a really good clue about what the conclusion is. Okay, so once you have identified the conclusion, go ahead and write it down, even though ultimately it's going to be the last line in your reconstruction. You want to go ahead and write it down to help keep yourself focused. Okay, then after that, you're going to reread the reading and look for premises. The premises will be the key ideas and claims that show why the conclusion is reasonable or true. That's what you're looking for. Students will often say they have a harder time seeing where one premise ends and another one begins. And this can especially happen when an author has a lot of extra content in the piece, or their writing is very wordy or very dense. So I recommend that you pay attention to the vocabulary that's being used as you move through that reading. Often, when the author is making many statements around one theme or about one concept or one key word, they are describing and filling out their ideas about one premise. And then when you see new key ideas introduced through new vocabulary, that can often mean that they're now moving on to another premise. This isn't always true. It isn't a hard and fast rule because, let's face it, when an author is writing an article or a book, they can write in their own style, and people have a lot of different writing styles. But it can often be helpful to look closely at the vocabulary being used, and especially when you see a new vocabulary term coming in to the reading and it's a really important idea. It's a new idea and it's a shift, then you should be looking for a new premise at this point. Okay. The fourth bullet here is really important. Don't worry about the number of premises. Instead, you need to try to include all the key ideas. The number of premises is often going to differ between, person to person who's doing the reconstruction because of how they group the ideas that make up this argument. So I tend to have a lot of premises when I do a reconstruction because I like to break the ideas down as far as I can. But, someone might have a more efficient writing style and they group several ideas together into a premise, and so they have fewer premises. So yeah, I might have one student who turns in a reconstruction with 5 premises and they do a great job. And the next student turns in the same assignment and had 9 premises and they also did a great job. So again, there's not going to be one right or wrong answer about the number of premises, but the idea is to make sure you have included all of the key ideas. And sometimes several ideas can be grouped together on one line. And as long as that reads well and it's still clear and helps us to clearly understand how the argument functions, then that's fine. The last bullet is something that you would double check when you're done with a draft of your reconstruction. You'd want to look at your conclusion and look at the keywords that appear in that conclusion, and then go back up and look through the premises and check that those keywords or synonyms also appear up in the premises. So, for example, if we have an argument about why vegetarianism is morally allowable, keywords there are vegetarianism and morally allowable. So up in the premises, we want to see the word vegetarianism or synonyms, not eating meat, or we want to see something about eating meat up in the premises, right? And if our conclusion has something about morally allowable, then up in the premises, we want to see the word moral, the word allowable, or synonyms like ethical, right, justified, or something like that. In a good argument, the keywords that are part of the conclusion are going to be in the premises as well, or synonyms or linked concepts will be up in the premises so that there's a connection between the premises and the conclusion. And the content that I assign for you all to read in the course are good arguments, and they're going to have that connection. At least most of the time they will. So go ahead and look for that, because it might help you find a place where you've missed an important idea in your premises section, and then you can go back and add it. The last 2 slides of the lecture give you an example of argument reconstruction. Here's the argument I'll be reconstructing. This is an excerpt from an article by Jay Bost. And so what you see on the slide is Jay Bost's writing, and he expresses an argument here. And then on the next slide, I'll show you my reconstruction. So what I would suggest you do at this point is pause the lecture, take some time to read the slide carefully. If you feel up for it, go ahead and try to do your own reconstruction. Just jot it down, get what you can, do your best with it, and then go on to the next slide, and then you can see mine and see what I included and compare it to yours. Here's my reconstruction, and you see I identified 4 premises. Now, as I said earlier, some people might have done this with 5 premises or 6 or 3, and that can vary depending on how we cluster the ideas when we state them, how we construct our sentences. But as long as we all get the same key ideas, and that is the ideas that are necessary to support the conclusion, then we're okay. Not all argument reconstructions will have 4 premises. The number of premises is up to the person doing the reconstruction. They have to use their judgment. But other than the number of premises, when you do a reconstruction, it's going to basically look like this. You want to write one premise per line and label the premises with P1, P2, P3, and so on. Or if you want, you can write out premise 1, premise 2, and so on. You want to write the conclusion last and label it with C or with conclusion. Also, as you see here on the slide, each premise is one sentence long only, and all of the sentences end with periods, so that's important too. What I'm doing right now is I'm talking through all of the ways that I have followed the rules for argument reconstruction that I talked about earlier in the lecture. So let's get into the premises, and then I'll talk about within each premise, how did I follow the rules for argument reconstruction? Okay, premise 1, something is morally good when it preserves the natural environment. This is a really important idea in the argument. It's a central idea. It's necessary to how Bost supports his conclusion, but I've put it in my own words. I've stated it my own way, really from scratch. I created a whole new sentence, but to capture Bost's idea. And I tried to make my sentence very clear, very simple, and straightforward. Premise 2, in some locations, meat can be sustainably raised and vegetarian proteins cannot be. Again, what I'm doing here is I'm expressing an important idea of J. Bost's argument, but I'm trying to do it in my very own way, which is also clear, simple, and straightforward. The argument reconstruction should be very easy to read, and we are walking a fine line between creating a reconstruction that's very clear and very simple and a reconstruction that still contains all the important ideas of the argument. This definitely takes some practice, but I do want you to find that fine line. That's what we're shooting for. Okay, premise 3, vegetarian proteins produced for shipping are grown using large-scale agriculture, which is bad for the environment. This is an important premise because it specifically states how vegetarianism can harm the environment when a vegetarian lives in a location where the proteins have to be shipped into them. And we're thinking about like long shipping distances. Premise 4, in some locations, a diet including meat is better for the environment than a vegetarian diet. And then finally, the conclusion, in some locations, it's morally required to eat meat. You may have remembered from reading the previous slide that Bost uses the example of a desert in Arizona, but that was an example. He wasn't specifically writing just about Arizona. He really meant to be producing an argument that was more general in nature. I feel that the way I've stated the conclusion here captures what he was trying to say, which is that in some locations, namely places where vegetarian proteins can't be locally grown, it's morally required to eat meat. Okay, good. So here are some things you can do with this reconstruction that you see on the slide. So first of all, if you tried to write your own reconstruction when you were reading the previous slide that had the Bost excerpt on it, you can compare your reconstruction to this one. And again, we don't necessarily have to have the exact same number of premises, but you want to look closely at the ideas you included and the ideas I included and compare them. Look at the conclusions and see if your conclusion, even though it'll be in different words, does it mean the same thing? That's what I'm looking for. Another thing you can do with this reconstruction to get a little practice is to look at this reconstruction alongside the excerpt that was on the previous slide and try to work backwards, looking at the premises I've written down here and the conclusion, and find where Bost says things that indicate these premises and this conclusion. So where in the Bost excerpt do we see this content? And sometimes working backwards can help you understand, how to write a reconstruction later when you're just flying solo and writing one yourself. All right, that's argument reconstruction. If you have any questions about it, definitely please reach out to me and ask.